How much of an impact do you think the murder of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement, combined with COVID-19 forcing the world to sit still, has had on your efforts fighting for the rights of Indigenous peoples?
One of the things that we have to recognize and realize with the death of George Floyd is we have to recognize that our African brothers and sisters are Indigenous as well. And we have to understand the indigeneity that comes with them and has traveled with them. And although a lot have lost contact, there was a purposeful means of doing so. And so we have to look at the historical account of racism and how it affected their people, often referred to as like slaves, you know. And I grew up in a pretty diverse place in California, in the Bay Area. And so I'm not going to go through this whole thing of like, oh, I had X amount of friends or anything of that nature. But my friends who were Black, I always reminded about the African descent, you know. And I grew up in a pretty cool era when there was a lot of Afrocentric hip hop music, you know, from Stetsasonic to, you know, literally everybody wearing kente cloths, Queen Latifah, and just continual, you know, that whole effort, you know, growing into like a different world on TV, things of that nature. And so we saw things with like groups like Arrested Development, where the culture was being reintegrated, you know, and the power that came with that, the awareness that came with that birthed people like Lauryn Hill, and things of that nature. So we see that Indigenous spirit still alive, you know, and so when we see the combinations of those worlds, we know, you know, where they come from, what they come from. And so there's a support there because our lives intersect, our struggles intersect. Just like when African people were running away from slave plantations, sometimes they would come across tribes, and those tribes knew who they were dealing with, you know, and were like, they integrated them into the tribe, you know. And the thing is, with what happened through history is we know that we had that commonality. We had that commonality of oppression. And so when we see that, and we see the world focused the way it is, you know, and we see the people are refuting that Black Lives Matter, you know, and to understand the racist nature of police brutality and things of that nature, we suffer right there with them. You know, if you were to look at statistics and number and people that suffer per capita, because again, we have to remember per capita, what that actually means is that yes, Black and Indigenous people are at the top of the list when it comes to victims of police brutality, leading up to and including murder. With the world focused on those things, this was able to give us pause, you know, and be able to reflect on what was happening because we didn't have anywhere else to go with the news, with everything that we saw. And it was just the straw that it was the conditions created by colonial force upon George Floyd. And I think that we can all say that watching that and looking at that, we all saw a piece of ourselves in that and the inhumanity that was in there and the means of destruction at the hands of a people who don't have any compassion or empathy for the destruction created to our daily lives in so many different facets. We're not just talking about like a physical attack, we're talking about a spiritual attack, an intellectual attack. There are so many ways that we are constantly dealing with this marginalization and this dehumanizing of our being. And so when we look at our brothers and sisters across the globe, you know, I'm fortunate that I have a brother that's from Tibet, you know, and what he deals with and everything that he has to deal with being out here and people finding those common grounds. Like he actually had a child with a Mohawk woman, you know, and we know that what displacement and dispossession does. And so the things that happened with George Floyd, I happen to be fortunate enough growing up in the Bay Area that I was encouraged by some of the original Black Panthers from Oakland. We'd be at a lot of the same events. And when they saw us showing up as younger people, you know, dressed out and ready to fight for justice, they encouraged us highly. And we're like, hey, brother, hey, sister, hey, so good to see the Indigenous people here. We were welcomed with open arms and educated by them. and there were revolutionaries in the street. And I remember being gifted, the autobiography of Malcolm X by an African brother in Oakland. Well, as I was walking by, he's like, "Hey, young man, you need to read this." And at the time, I'm to be full disclosure, I wasn't leading the most straight and narrow life, and I know the intent was there, and it was part of my awakening as a human being. And so when we look at these things and we center these things upon what the mechanism is that causes that type of death and destruction and things of that nature, and the public outcry for those types of change, the biggest problem is that they are happening now. We're still continuing to ask for the same things that were asked for by Martin Luther King. And even going further back to Sitting Bull, Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, Nat Turner. This is the discussion that we're having today. Is respect has everything to do with it. That's the first start. That's the first basis of any relationship, is a level of respect. And until people understand that, we're always going to have these problems. And they're going to continue. Because when you can dehumanize someone, it's not so hard to harm them in the worst manner possible.
I think really just this combination of events, really, George Floyd, Black Lives Matter, COVID-19, has really opened up a lot of dialogue and conversation to a lot of people. And as somebody who comes from Cuban Caribbean, as well as Native American, as well as Indigenous from Turtle Island, I have this kind of a balancing act that I have to participate in a lot of ways, in terms of how I'm conversating with my peers and from either side of my culture, right? And unfortunately, I come from a background, my heritage on both my Native American side, my Mashpee side, and my Caribbean side. They were both slaves, so I'm very much the offspring of slavery, and because of that, I'm very much acutely aware of how the two movements are not, in fact, two movements. They're the same, and I really don't think there's any difference between the George Floyd events and the Black Lives Matter movement, because effectively from the dawn of all of this going down from 400 years ago, plus years ago, the two journeys have been very much intertwined, very much linked. The same events that happen in the same forms of oppression, the same forms of treatment that go across all the cultures of oppressed peoples, especially in the United States. And that really also pretty much extends to all people of color that were involved in building this United States, this with the Latinx community, and and how they are our indigenous brothers as well, brothers and sisters, and also then for the Chinese immigrants who received incredibly harsh treatment as well when they first landed on the shores, just trying to escape their situation, and so on and so forth. And so really, I think actually what's happening is not so much an impact on how it's helped, but actually it's kind of reminded people of how it's always been for us as oppressed minorities fighting together, and how we've always pretty much done that from get-go, because that's the commonality that we shared, is the trauma and the oppression. And so it's not necessarily it's had a more helpful influence, but it's just reminded us of how integral we are together as a people. Like Christopher says, it's a global community. That's what we are. And it's just a reminder of that. And so I have to balance this of talking to people who are talking about co-opting and optics, and remind them that actually really this whole thing, when we talk together, when we voice together, it's so much more beneficial than trying to do it isolated. I think that's the most important thing, really, more than anything.